Hello everyone, and welcome to another painting video. Today I'll be trying to get ahead of my painting queue by, well, painting some heads. I am very sorry about that. Anyway, so for a bit of background on this project, I recently have been burling through a load of separate kill teams. I've just kind of bought all of the box sets and decided I'll just paint a bit of everything. So this is one of these projects. So an interesting thing about these models is that the armor's head location is very cowled by a big solid bit of armor, which makes it difficult to access the head once it's glued in. So normally I don't actually paint the head separately, but this time I decided to make an exception, also because I decided that rather than just doing armored heads, which I usually do just to avoid having to paint flesh for squads of Space Marines, I would be a bit fancy and practice my flesh techniques, so here I am. At this early stage we're just laying down the base coats, so nothing particularly fancy about it. You may recall that I have already produced a video on flesh tones in general, detailing what color triads I use. I have made some changes since to my usual method, especially for more human looking flesh tones, and I'll be doing them in this video. So right now I'm just applying the deepest coat. This color will not be visible on the model anyway. This is an underpainted layer, if that's the right word for it. Our midtone is going to go over this layer and cover pretty much 100% of the skin's surface area. So since base coating is always the least fun part of the process, let's skip through it a little bit, shall we? So, shouldn't have to say it right now, but 2 thin layers of thin paint. I usually go 3 just to make sure it's not patchy, and then just get an even coverage all over the model. That's it. Okay, so now we are done with the initial undercoat. Now we're going to apply what is functionally the main coat. So first of all, I made a mistake early on with the middle figure, the guy in the cowl. I applied his highlight color when I meant to apply his mid-tone. I'll end up going back to correct that, so if you see me doing that, well, you'll know what happened. So the process for this is exactly the same as applying the base coat. 2 thin layers over the underpaint layer until you get a fully as even a layer as you can get. Since there's nothing particularly fancy about the stage or that's visually interesting, let's skip over most of it. Okay, so you may have noticed that there's been a bit of a camera angle change. This is because I wanted to experiment a bit more, and this is the more or less standard way that most YouTube painters appear to be painting, with the camera wrapped around them. Well, not really wrapped around them. I mean, directly in their lap, basically, so you can get as close to a painter's eye view as you can get. So this is me experimenting. So as you can see, we're proceeding with the base coating, and yeah, to be honest, this is the first time I'm looking at it at this point, and I have to say it's definitely a better view. So let's hope that it keeps that way, and let's proceed with the video. Okay, now that we're done with the what is functionally the base coat, we'll do just a basic wash. So to be honest, I'm not even sure why I really made this video, as the techniques described aren't that different from the first ones I laid down. You put down your base coat, you layer it, and then, well, you don't layer it, you wash it, then you layer it. So yeah. So you'll notice that as I'm applying the wash, I'm just going to slather it on initially. But you'll notice as I get that initial layer on, I'll then go back and start clearing it up to start more precisely controlling where the wash goes. So you can see there I'm getting a damp brush. Now I'm just using the capillary action of the brush to start picking up some of the excess and getting rid of some of it off the top of the head to minimize the amount of shade on there. This is to try and use the wash to help me define where the shadows of this guy's facial features are. So while this is going on, I won't speed it up as fast, but yeah, since this is probably one of the more interesting stages, 4 times speed should be fine, and you should be able to see what I'm doing. So that's pretty much it. All of the washes are down, so let's just wait for it all to dry and see what it looks like when we're done. Alright, now we are ready to begin the layering process. So to start with, you can't see it now, but I have made sure to get my paint layers pretty thin and pretty transparent. That was me just testing it on the palette paper there. And now I'm going to start picking out the, well, intermediate areas. Yeah, the idea, of course, is I'm trying to work with the transparency of the paint to ensure that in order to start building up the color, I will need multiple layers. This is so I can gradually focus the color towards the highest areas of the miniature and basically glaze in the main the layer that we mostly covered up with the wash. You'll notice for this bald guy, I'm definitely giving the top of his head a lot of attention, as obviously that's where the sun is catching, and it'll get progressively darker as you follow the curvature of the skull. So you'd want to get that transition of color from dark to light happening until you reach the brow and the usual facial features, in which case, obviously start highlighting the brow ridge, the nose, and the cheekbones as you would a normal head miniature. So I'm trying to be as careful as I can with this brush. It's one of the GW Artificer layer brushes, and I'm only using the tip of it. I'm not trying to put get the actual body of the brush down, because what that would do is it would flood the surface of the model, and I want that precision application right now in order to start building up those layers very, very, very slowly. Alright, so about the guy with the cowl briefly. I didn't really bother to do many more features aside from the nose and the chin, since most of the face is, and the laugh lines of course, since most of the face is obviously obscured by the shadow of the cowl. I decided to let the shade I put in do most of the work for me. So yeah, but otherwise the same technique applies. You just thinly layer and gradually build up the color along the prominent areas. Alright, so I think this guy is the one I'm the most happy with, because I definitely find this, of all the sculpts, this one went on the best. And I also like the expression on his face. He looks vaguely disgusted at what he's seeing, which means his brow is a little crinkled, which means I had some fun picking out the wrinkles on his brow, which is yeah, see, not something I often do with miniatures, which is emphasize a lot more texture than there really is on the model by adding in some highlights where there isn't necessarily detail to highlight. But in all other respects, yeah, same process as the other models. You can also see there I'm going back in with a damp brush. What I'm doing there is I'm trying to clean up after I overlaid a particular spot, specifically the gap between the prominent chin and the lower lip. I'm trying to wipe away some of the paint to restore some of that original undercoated and shaded color. So, well, once I get back to work, that is, I'll be painting this guy the same way as I painted the first bald guy. Again, emphasizing the top of the skull by layering it as thin as I can to try and really emphasize that transition of color from the medium tone to the shaded tone. Okay, now we are going in for our final highlights, for the skin at least. So again, this is the final highlight color for the various triads I'm using. For more references to the particular triad I'm referring to, I advise you to take a look back through my... actually, no, scratch that. I'll put the triads I used in the comments to this video, because especially for the dark skin tone, they have changed up, as I mentioned earlier, they have changed up a bit from what I used to do. But other than that, I'm trying to be as sparing as I can with the this highlight, specifically aiming for the brow ridge, any furrows, the tip of the nose, the very tops of the laugh lines, and the very sharpest edges of the cheekbones, and the very tip of the chin. Also the tops of the ears. Yeah, that's pretty much it, really. And again, the paint is even thinner, and you'll notice the very, very, very small movements of the brush. I'm only touching the tip, and I'm only putting on a little bit at a time. This is to avoid getting impatient and to prevent the highlight from flooding onto the model and ruining our previous work. One thing which doesn't come across in this video, well, it actually might due to the weird shadows which are happening. I'm also wearing my Opti-visor at this point. For those of you who don't know, it's basically a magnification visor, which, since my eyes are notoriously bad, I find that this actually helps me see exactly where the tip of the brush is, which, since I've actually started trying to use it properly, it has dramatically improved my painting quality, especially when trying to do the very finest details. But I suppose ultimately there's no substitute for practice and patience with this kind of painting, so the tools can only take you so far, in my opinion. But they don't hurt if you know how to use them properly. So now for the final touches on this guy. Again, the nose, the brow ridge. You'll notice the very, very small and gentle motions. And finally, this is where I'm painting on that additional detail to try and get that furrowed brow. So I only need a small touch, just a little bit of paint on the brush. It's difficult to explain the consistency. It should go on, it'll be wet, but you should almost like make very, very small tapping motions. Extremely small. Not too hard, otherwise, you'll get more paint than you intend. And only the very tip of the brush should actually touch the model. Fortunately, the highlighting stage doesn't actually take that much time. It just requires a degree of precision. And we're done in just a few moments. So let's speed through what's left of this stage, then we'll move on to the detailing. Alright, so now onto the eyes. So for a start, the brush I'm using is not the GW Artificer one I was using for the previous step. This is a very, very ragged Winsor & Newton size 0, I believe. You can see that even in its decrepit state, it holds a point that is significantly better than the Artificer brush, which is remarkable given how much abuse this brush has suffered. By the way, this is my my Winsor & Newtons basically have several places in my painting set. There's the good ones, which barely ever get used. There's the mediocre, there's the ones in service for my good stuff, my serious projects, and then there are these sets, which are for rank and file armies, and they're the worst of the worst, well, the ones which have suffered the most abuse and I've been using the longest. As such, they're the ones that are closest to being unusable as brushes, but even at this state, they're still remarkably good brushes. So enough of ranting about the remarkable quality of Winsor & Newton, but yeah, so I'm doing the eyes now, as you've probably surmised. The colour I'm using is, I'm not using GW colours because I quite frankly don't trust them for this scale of work. To actually paint in the white of the eye, I've used Vallejo model colour off-white, extremely well thinned, and basically on a very, very damped down brush. Basically, the way I do it is I tamp down the brush on my paper towel after I've first loaded the brush to make sure I've only got a very controllable amount in the brush. So, and then immediately after, I apply the pupil with German grey. Now, the trick I was taught by a more professional painter than I, you don't want to use your starkest whites and darkest blacks because that makes the model look like he's surprised. Or she's surprised. Or they're surprised. That's better. Anyway, instead you want to use slightly more muted. Anyway, sorry, that's just me being weird. I had a blocked paint pot. That's the downside to the Vallejo model color paint pots, is that you occasionally have that issue once in a while. We have to do a manual clearance. Anyway, so my actual technique for doing eyes is fairly straightforward. I'm just going to start fast forwarding to the part where I start working on eyes again. So first of all, yeah, lay down the initial shape of the eye with the white, and then I keep on looking at it until I get the idea, or I get the feeling that the width of the eyes is identical across on the left and the right side of the face. And if I make a mistake or put in too much white, I go back to the original deepest base shade, thin it down a lot, and try and fill in the eye to the point where I think it is identical with the other eye. And then I keep doing this stage until I feel that the eyes look good. It's something that you only really get with practice, and to be honest, even though you only really get it with practice, you only really achieve it if you have access to at least one decent Winsor & Newton brush. Then of course I paint on the pupil, and to do this I try to aim the pupil as close to the bridge of the nose as possible. If you put the pupil too far out, unless you're deliberately trying to paint like a side-eye effect, it'll end up looking like he's cross-eyed, so you want to try and avoid that, obviously. And then if I feel a pupil is too big or not correctly placed, I'll then go back in with the white to try and shift where the pupil is to set the gaze more accurately. Like, I am the kind of masochist who does this for an army, but I would certainly only recommend you do this for your character figures or for small batches of miniatures. Anyway, the rest of this is pretty much for muchness, so I'm going to fast forward through a lot of it. So now, since we're working on other facial details, another thing I'm going to quickly hit are the teeth for the models where it's appropriate. In this case, there is this guy who's shouting and the guy with the mutton chops who is also shouting. I'm going to paint their teeth just by getting some of the off-white that I used as the eye white color and just paint little squares along the teeth and use the original shade color as the gap between the teeth. So I'll just basically do this until I feel that it looks good, then I'll move on. So for this stage we're going to do the lips. Now I'm opting to play it simple for this because these are, well, I'm not aiming for high display, just high level tabletop, and well, so the color I'll use for this is just the base color, and I'll highlight up to the mid-tone color to basically give the lips a darker appearance in general. So I'm going to emphasize this on the bottom lip when the models are shouting, and on the top lip when the models have their mouths closed. This is to basically just try to keep the effects subtle, as if it's well known that if you try and more completely paint the lips this way, you will end up inevitably making the model look like it's wearing lipstick. They're wearing lipstick. Yeah. So these are the highlight colors. It's just a simple matter of painting a thin line on the top, well, not even a thin line really. I just stipple a very thin line across the very top of the lip, just to try and get a very subtle hint of highlight going. Okay, finally, we're getting towards the closing stages of the models. So here we go. We're going to be painting the hair and all of the other necessary details. So to start with, I'll do the Dark Angel robe, Dark Angel green. Now, you'll notice that when I speed this up, I'm going to basically go through several models in sequence. since this is an airbrush paint I'm using, as I'm out of my usual Caliban green, this will take many layers to dry, so I'll be coming back to it quite frequently. And you'll also notice that when I get around to painting on the inside of the cowl, that goes without saying, be extremely careful. Cover the grey primer, or the black and white primer, as to be more accurate, but be extremely careful not to mess up your work already. And if you can't quite get in there, that's fine, just leave it, let the shade do the work for you. So, onto hair colour now. The guy on the left, I'm going to aim for a yellowish blonde. The centre guy, I'm going to aim for black. And the guy on the right, I'm going to aim for an orangey red. Hair has always been a bit of a sticking point for me. I'm not good at it, so I did a bit of experimentation to accomplish these steps, and I think the results turned out okay, but we shall see. So to start with, we'll put down our base coat as we would any normal colour, just 2 thin layers of black, being very careful working our way up to the flesh. It's okay if you get a little bit on, just don't do too much, as you know, hair is a messy thing which tends to go everywhere, so a few little hints of black on the flesh makes it look like stray hairs. Just be careful in that initial application to avoid too much overflow. Same deal with the blonde guy. I'm just starting by painting the individual strands of the hair and gradually filling it out with colour until I have a couple of even layers. So since this is basically, well, base coating, let's just skip through the entire lot of it. So for our mutton chops guy here, I opted to use a fairly pale orange, Jacaro orange I believe, as our initial base coat. The idea with this process is that we apply our base coat and then apply our highlights and then we shade it to not only provide depth to the hair but also to basically tie all the others together, to like put a filter over all of them so they look a lot more consistent. And of course, I'll keep going back and forth over the colours until I am more or less happy with the results. So now we're on to our initial I'm not going to say highlights because it's not quite the same technique. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to accentuate the points of the hair towards the edges and towards the roots where the hair would be the thinnest. That's where the colour tends to be the most washed out. So that's generally where you want to focus your highlights, or so I've been led to believe at least. As I said, I've never been good with painting hair. So since this guy basically has a buzz cut, all I'm doing is a very, very careful stipple motion with the tip of the brush to try and get both strands of hair and individual like curls and dots painted on the model to try and imply that sense of texture that isn't really there. And once we've done our highlight layer, as I mentioned before, we'll filter it with, in this case, Nuln oil. Now the mix I'm using is 1 part Nuln oil and 2 parts Lahmian medium to get a very, very thin shade, almost a glaze basically. So this should, unlike Nuln oil straight from the pot, this should preserve a lot of our initial highlighting work that we did earlier on. So unlike the buzz cut guy, the guy with the long, luxurious golden locks is getting a more, I don't know, more trad treatment of his hair. I'm focusing the highlights towards the ends of the strands and the roots of the hair. So I'm just, as usual, applying this in a similar manner to the previous guy. I'm just, you tip of the brush, very, very thin strokes. I'm going to build this up over successive layers and gradually adding in more of the highlight color until it's almost white, but not quite. And finally, we'll do our shade, this time with Seraphim Sepia, likewise diluted with a lot of Lahmian medium to try and preserve those initial colours and just provide more of a filter than a shade. And once that is done, the hair is done. We don't need to touch it anymore. So yeah, we'll proceed with the highlights, lightening the orange until we're more or less happy with the result. Then after that, we'll apply a filter / shade in the same manner that we did previously. I believe I tried Seraphim Sepia and I didn't think that was strong enough, so I moved over to Carbon Crimson, and I thought that was a much better colour for this. Okay, my mistake, that colour was Reikland Flesh Shade, which is fine because it's a very red shade anyway. It should neatly do the job I was hoping for. Well, should have, but we'll wait and see. Okay, so I'll correct myself. It looks like I didn't use Carbon Crimson. Instead, I just waited for the subsequent shade layers to dry and just did multiple layers of Reikland Flesh Shade until I was satisfied with the red colour, which ultimately turned out well in the end, I think. Sorry, this is what happens when you don't write this down and you record the audio after the fact. Okay, and we're just about done. I won't detail finishing off how to shade the cloak because that's not really the subject of this video, and now I'm getting ready to well, begin final attachments to the miniatures. All I have to do is paint up any of the body glove and like power armor components that are actually on the head, and then we're pretty much good to go. So let's move on to the finished result. So there we have it. All the heads of our Deathwatch kill team are now attached to their rightful owners, and they're ready to purge Xenos throughout the galaxy, blah blah blah. So overall, I think keeping the heads off for painting was definitely an improvement, but yeah, like I said, I wouldn't do this for a line unit because, quite frankly, that's too much effort. I'll just stick to painting the blue helmets and avoid painting additional flesh when I can. Anyway, that just about wraps us up. I'd like to say thanks for watching if you've made it this far. I'm not going to tell you to subscribe because what would be the point? It's not as if I'm monetizing this anyway, nor am I selling merch. The purpose of this channel has always been to just try and communicate what I know to try and give back to the painting community. The very same one that basically taught me so much on how to paint properly once I decided to get back into 40k proper. Anyway, that's pretty much it from me. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video, whenever that may be. Peace out.